We've been looking at sovereignty, the concept of who has the right to decide government, which is a very fundamental right in any democracy. And in Scotland in particular, it's highly problematic. We might describe it as a battle of sovereignties, a British view and indeed a Scottish view, which has been on the go, certainly since Brexit 2016 brought these matters to a head. So we've been examining what people out there, as it were, believe the position to be and what they would prefer in Scotland. And we've devised some questions which we've carried on a couple of surveys now, asking people who they think has the right to decide who governs Scotland. That is a theoretical right, as well as, given Brexit and the fact that Scotland voted to remain and not to leave, should Scots accept the pan-British decision, or should they still have the right to decide whether Scotland should be part of the European Union? So that's the basis on which we've been examining the notion of sovereignty, the concept, if you like, of sovereignty, which has been certainly a dominant political feature of the last 4, 5 or 6 years, certainly since Brexit of 2016. So we've tried to get at the proportions in Scotland, whether people are what we have called Scottish sovereigntists, that is, people who believe in the right of self-determination on the one hand, and indeed what we might call British sovereigntists or British unionists on the other hand. And what we've discovered in the surveys that we've done, the two surveys that we've done, is that about 30%, 3 in 10 of people in Scotland can be described as Scottish sovereigntists, and about 1 in 10% as British unionists. Now, if you add those figures together, of course, it means that most people in Scotland, over half, are somewhere in between. And we've known that for some time, that on the one hand, there is a kind of degrees of sovereignty, and rather than thinking that sovereignty is either or, either Scotland is sovereign or not, then public opinion in Scotland cross a spectrum of views on sovereignty. So the first point to make is that most people in Scotland are somewhere along that spectrum. They're not at either end, but the largest number, the largest proportion of people in Scotland are at the sovereigntist end. They believe that the Scottish Parliament has the right of self-determination, if you like, and only 1 in 10 that the UK, because Scotland is part of the UK, then that should determine how Scotland is governed. Now, what is further intriguing, we think, is that if you then look at the two polar positions, I wouldn't call them extremes, but polar positions of sovereigntists on the one hand and unionists on the other hand, you find that there is a considerable mix of views within those two polar opposites. For example, among Scottish sovereigntists, there is acceptance of shared decision making between a UK perspective, the British government on the one hand, and the Scottish government on the other. There is a mix of perspectives. Now, for example, we asked people in the event of independence for Scotland, what kind of currency should Scotland have? Should it share a currency with the rest of the United Kingdom, or indeed have its own currency, or indeed, for that matter, share the euro? But most people, just over half of sovereigntists, remember, believe that there should be a shared currency with the rest of the United Kingdom, even in the event of Scottish independence. A similar figure, less than half, but still substantial, believe that Scotland should share the same armed forces as the rest of the United Kingdom in the event of independence. So there's quite a lot of sovereigntists who believe in the absolute right of self-determination to accept shared sovereignty with the rest of the United Kingdom with regard to a currency, with regard to having a shared armed forces, that's the Army, Navy, Air Force and so on, in the event of independence. The same is true of the Unionists, as it were. Those who believe that Scotland should not have the right of self-determination still accept that there should be shared a degree of shared decision making with regard to, for example, deciding on a referendum on independence, that should be a shared view between the British government and a Scottish government, even although they happen to believe that Scotland does not have the right to determine how it is governed on its own. So what we find is that there is a considerable amount of overlap, if you like. It's not that people are confused, it's that they believe that there's a nuance, there's a shared understanding, even in the event of Scotland being independent. And that is the case of people who believe very firmly in the right that the British government, because Scotland joined the British state in 1707 in a Treaty of Union, should still be sharing some of those responsibilities. If we take some examples of that, look at farming, which is a major economic responsibility in Scotland. There is a view that sharing responsibility for farming decisions between Britain and Scotland in the event of independence should be the case. And that is as true of people who accept that Westminster should have the right of self-determination over Scotland, as well as people, as you would expect, who think that a Scottish Parliament, an independent Scottish Parliament, should have that responsibility. So what is coming over in the surveys is a considerable amount of nuance, of complexity, because actually, even if Scotland became independent, in that eventuality, there would still be a lot of shared decision making. While people who accept that Scotland should not have the right of self-determination also accept that a Scottish Parliament, a devolved Scottish Parliament, should share in a lot of the responsibilities, and everything should not be decided by the British government. So now that is interesting, because the whole political complexion over the last decade or so, certainly since 2016 and Brexit, has been for two polar positions of Scottish sovereignty on the one hand and British sovereignty or union on the other. And what we find is not only do most people in Scotland have a complex, mixed view, a nuanced view of that, but that even on the two polar positions of sovereignty on the one hand and union on the other hand, the supporters of each of those two positions also share that the other party, whether it's the British state with regard to sovereigntism on the one hand and the Scottish Parliament on the other, in the case of being a unionist, there should be a sharing of responsibilities. But you wouldn't really know that from the ways in which the political agenda in the media and elsewhere are operating. So we believe, and we will pursue more of this kind of work in getting at what people out there in the real world, the Scotland of today, are thinking. So sovereignty is an interesting issue. It's complex. It's certainly in people's minds, even if they do not have a very simple view of it, but they understand the concept. It's often said before that, well, it's too complicated, that sovereignty as an idea, as a theoretical concept. Well, actually, you can measure it. You can get at it through survey work. You can get people to talk about it, and they certainly seem to understand what is meant by that. So that the nuance is not the result of confusion and misunderstanding, but of appreciating that in the modern complex world, things are much more complex than it may seem.